Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 6, and we'll continue our thoughts from there this evening. Hopefully this morning we were able to be reminded of a very important story in the Scriptures that is inspiring both to the young and to the old. You never really outgrow the story of Daniel in the lion's den, particularly when you know and understand the background of those things. One thing you have to be impressed with as a Bible student when you read through the Scriptures is the consistency, particularly when you read through the book of Daniel, is the consistency in the life of God's servant. Now, there were other servants there, and don't know exactly how all of them were living, but these were chosen by the Holy Spirit to say, this is how these 4 Hebrew youth lived. And they were consistent about everything they did. They seemed to have made up their mind, purposed in their hearts, to do what God wanted them to do, no matter what happened. And they didn't know what was going to happen. They were taken from their homeland, made eunuchs, separated from their families, and were told they were going to be there 70 years. Now, sometimes in life, when circumstances don't go the way I want them to go, it depresses me. I think, well, I wish it wasn't that way. I wish it didn't turn out that way. And see, if you start at that place, you're going to be challenged in that place to stay faithful to the Lord. But if you make up your mind and say, I don't really know what the future holds, there are certain things about the future that God's told us about our eternal well-being, if we're faithful to Him. And so these 4 Hebrew youth do that. And so they determine nothing's going to get in the way with our relationship to God. We don't know what's going to happen around us, but we know what's happening in us in our commitment to God. And here's what we're going to do. And that's consistent. It was consistent when you had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being required to bow down to the golden image. They refused to do it. And when they were asked about that and given a second chance about that, they were extremely focused about their relationship to God. When the king said, is your God going to deliver you? And he said, don't know that. He can. He has the power to, but he may not. But we're still not going to bow down to the image. There's something liberating about making up your mind to do what God tells you to do. It removes all the other calamities of life. Say, I don't know, but I'm going to do what God told me to do. And whatever happens, God's going to take care of me. You don't find anywhere else to this degree until you get to the New Testament Christians, people being that focused in difficult circumstances. But this whole book is given to that. So we looked at that this morning and we focused upon the persistent nature of Daniel's life. So as we reconnect with that and say Daniel was consistent in how he lived and his commitment to God. Everybody around him knew that. The only way we're going to trap Daniel is to do something that has a focus upon his relationship to his God. He's going to keep his God's commandment. Now what a commentary on Daniel, that everybody would know that. This man is consistent in his life. He's respected in his life. Even the leaders who are over him are elevating him because of his life. That's who he is. He has favor in the eyes of these people because they trust him. And so how are we going to trap him? Well, we've got to do something that would be put him in a position to have to choose between bowing down to God or being faithful to God or the king's command. And these new rulers, the Medes and Persians, have a reputation that when they make a law, it can't be changed. There's no manipulating or negotiating or saying, well, we didn't really mean that, or we won't enforce that. It's not going to be changed. So they knew that. So we can take this new king, this new ruler, and the law that he has to live by, and we can take Daniel in the law that he has to live by, and we can put him in conflict with each other. And we know Daniel is going to keep his God's law. I would hope that people around me would see me that way. But do they? As I'm taking these photographs along the way, do I see that? Am I that consistent? That I'm going to do what God tells me to do no matter what? Or are there some situations in life think, well, would it really make a difference? I mean, I'm better than most. Maybe I don't have to live up to this standard. Daniel never had those discussions with himself because he purposed in his heart, I'm going to do what God tells me to do. I'm not going to defile myself. And so they knew that about him. He'd been consistent in how he handled that. And when we look at that, it reminds us of the New Testament apostles. When they were being persecuted, those people who were accusing them and threatening them had that same kind of image of them. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 13, it said that they took note, they were conscious of, that these people had been with Jesus. Their behavior, their consistency, their conviction, their courage reminded them of Jesus. That's what you have in Daniel here. And so we see his character and his spirit is well known. So there's no compromising there on his part. But here's what the lessons I want us to take with us tonight. Is that everything about Daniel in this context of chapter 6 caused people around him to focus on God. Not just Daniel. Daniel's like everybody else. He's one of the 3 presidents, and he's over probably 40 of these princes, because there's 120 of them and 3 presidents. So you kind of assume that they divided them up, and so he's over some, and the other 2 are over some. And so he's like other people in a lot of ways. He has a responsibility similar to the other presidents. But the king is looking at Daniel and thinking, I'd like to put him over all these people, because he's got a spirit about him that can be trusted. So here's Daniel in this context, but when people look at him saying, look, we can't do anything that would trap him unless we focus on his God and the commandments his God's given him. So where's the focus? Not just on Daniel. Daniel's relationship to his God. Got to do something about that. It's got to be in that realm, or we're just not going to have any chance of ever trapping him. So when he does that, he brings it before the king, and he evidently signs this law without reading it, trusts these people he put in charge, that they wouldn't put him in a position to have to be accused of something. And so they sign that, he signs that, and when Daniel does what he's always done. What's Daniel doing? Praying to his God. What did the people who plotted against him know? He's going to be in communication with his God. His commitment is going to cause him to want to always communicate with his God. He's consistent about that. We know that about him. And so when he is brought before the king and he has violated this commandment, the king is angry at himself, as we mentioned this morning. He's displeased that he allowed this to happen, that he signed it and now it can't be changed. And the person he trusts most in the kingdom is Daniel. And now he's allowed Daniel to be put in a position where the law's got to be kept, but he's going to be thrown into the lion's den. But here's what I want you to, one lesson I want to take. We see what led them to make that decision is his relationship to his God. So God's the focal point. And so when they bring him in before the king, and you get to verse 15, it said, and then these men assembled unto the king and said, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians, that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. Because they knew the king was trying to find a way for Daniel to not be held to this law. And so they're watching him going through this dilemma in verse 14, and they say, Remind you, O king, these laws can't be changed. So the king then commanded that they bring Daniel in and cast him into the lion's den. But notice what the king said. Notice the focus stays on God, and how you and I in our lives need to have that kind of commitment that would cause people to see, look, he trusts in his God. The history in his relationship to God is that God always takes care of his own. They already have as a backdrop, the people of the land, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had similar position where they wouldn't bow down to the image. They were thrown into the fire, and what did God do? Deliver them. So notice what Darius says here. And so when he commands it to be thrown into the lion's den, Now the king spake and said unto Daniel. Now, I don't know about you, but, I have this image of the king growing close to Daniel. He's been fretting over this thing, trying to find a way out of this thing, and it can't be done. And so he comes close to Daniel, and he said, Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. What a reputation. Daniel, you serve your God continually. He knows Daniel. He's impressed with Daniel. He wants to elevate Daniel. And he knows Daniel's relationship with his God. And so he comes before Daniel and said, the God whom you serve continually, he will deliver thee. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of reputation? That your confidence in God would be such that people around you know that confidence? So much so that they would take on that confidence and say, he trusts his God and his God will deliver him. Now, sometimes we put qualifications on that deliverance. Daniel doesn't put any qualification. Just like his comrades, God could deliver him from the lion's den, but he may not. But he's not going to change anyway. He's not going to say, okay, I won't pray anymore until this edict is over. I won't pray anymore to my God. He didn't make any compromises. He didn't try to defend himself. But here's the king acknowledging the focus is on God, not on Daniel. He wants Daniel to be delivered, but he knows the only one who can deliver him is his God. You see, if we live our lives so that people's focus is always on our God and not just on us, our relationship to our God allows people to see and know God. Just like they took note that Peter and John had been with Jesus. Why? Because of how they behaved. But whose name is mentioned? Jesus. Whose name were they commanded no longer to speak? Jesus. Why? Because they reminded those people of Jesus. And so here, Daniel draws this focus, keeps this focus on God, even when he's being thrown in the lion's den. And the king is desperate for God, Daniel's God to deliver him. And so a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and we mentioned that this morning. It was sealed, much like the tomb of Jesus was sealed. So he couldn't get out. And by this time, Daniel's in his 80s, and so he's in the lion's den. And when that's going on, the king has to use his own insignia to say, this is the law of the Mede and Persian. I represent that law. And so this sealing of this this stone over the lion's den is by his approval and his authority. And then it said, and that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. He's in the lion's den. Not going to get him out. He's going to have to stay there. And then the king went to his palace that night and he fasted. Neither was instruments or music brought before him, and his sleep, he went without sleep. So he didn't want to do anything to make him feel better or for the magnitude of this decision to be lifted off of his shoulders. He recognized what had happened. He was displeased with his own participation in what happened. And he desperately wanted this man that he trusted, that he respected, to be delivered. So he fretted over that. And then notice the focus comes back to God. He didn't say, Daniel, were you able to lift the stone off the lion's den? Daniel, were you ever able to fight your way out of the lion's den? He immediately focused upon Daniel's God. He says, excuse me, in the verse 19, and the king arose early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of the lions. Didn't get any sleep, so might as well go take care of matters. Left early, went to the lion's den, and then he says in verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried with lamentations. You ever had those moments when you were so overwhelmed with emotions that your voice cracks? You don't just ask a question, you just don't make a plea, but your voice cracks. His lamentation, his concern over Daniel caused his voice to crack. You could hear his heart and his voice, the lamentations that he has here. And he said, he spake and said, Daniel, oh Daniel. He's just desperate to hear Daniel's voice, to know Daniel's okay. Ever had something happen to someone that you love? Maybe you almost have an accident or something and you want to make sure everybody's okay. And your voice cracks because you're so desperate to make sure that everybody's okay. Oh, are you okay? You want to make sure everybody's okay. And so he pleads, Daniel, the servant of the living God. Notice the focus is on God. It's not just on Daniel. Daniel, being a servant of the living God, is what the king is focused on. I want my life to be lived in such a way that people know my God. And every time my name comes up, that they automatically think about my God. I don't want the end of my life to come and say, well, you know, these are some things that I remember about Jerry and it has nothing to do with God. I would feel like I didn't live my life the way I needed to live if my life is summed up without God being the focus. Daniel could have been eaten by the lions. But this king is holding out hope that this God that Daniel serves, and he said, the servant of the living God. Daniel, you are serving the living God. There's a history here that they know about the God of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said, is thy God whom thou servest continually. Not just these magnificent deeds that God has done, but the life that Daniel has lived. The king calls into question. He said, the living God that you serve continually. Not just when we assemble on Sunday mornings. Not just when we're together and it's easy to do that. But continually. That every decision we make and every relationship we have and everything we do is to make sure our relationship with our God is what it ought to be. That we think and process before we speak so that we don't speak in such a way that would defame our God. Or our connection with our God would soil God's name. Because you see, if we're going to be a Christ-like person, then we need to behave like Christ, shouldn't we? That's why the apostles were identified as having been with Jesus, because they behaved like Jesus. And so he's pleading. He's hoping he'll hear Daniel's response. But he recognizes that Daniel's in this position. He's in that lion's den because of his consistent, continual service to God. He's even serving God while he's in captivity because he's doing what God told him to do while he's in captivity. And all of a sudden, God is the focus of everybody around Daniel because of Daniel's relationship with his God. Then Daniel said unto the king, O king, live forever. Have you noticed consistently through the book of Daniel that when these Hebrew youth get into trouble in the sense that people are trying to persecute them, that they're respectful to their persecutors? I find that really hard to do. I really do. I find that really hard to do. But they're respectful. Part of the reason they're respectful is these persecutors, these foreign leaders, these captors took them captive because God commissioned them to. They know they're in captivity because of the disobedience of the Israelites. They know why they're there. And so these are just tools that God used to get their attention and say, not going to put up with idolatry. If you're going to behave like the world and live like the world, then I'm going to allow the world to take you captive. So they know that. They understand that. And so they're respectful to those who are their captors because they know they're going to be their captors for 70 years. And so he responded to the king and said, you knew better than this. Yes, I'm still alive. No, the lions haven't eaten me. So who do you think you were throwing me in this den? No, I'm okay. But he's respectful toward the king. And he said, O king, live forever. You know, you kind of want to say, don't you? I shouldn't put you in the picture. I'd want to say on some occasion, Yeah, and wait till you see what my God's going to do to you. For you not to be strong enough to say, no, I'm not going to put him in the lion's den. Wait till you see what God does to you. That wasn't his response. He's saying, in that image of the golden head was Nebuchadnezzar. And now you have the leader who represents the breast and the arms of silver. What was the image about? God put those people in place. You going to be disrespectful for them? Not Daniel. Why? The focus is on God. But notice what else he said. Then he said, my God has sent his angel. He didn't take any credit for the being spared in this situation. He said, my God has sent his angel and has shut the mouths, at the lion's mouth, and they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocence was found in me, and also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt. The king already knows that, doesn't he? How did I get manipulated to do this, something like this? He was displeased in himself of not paying closer attention to what was going on. He knew Daniel was innocent. He knew he hadn't done anything that would cause him to be put in this lion's den. And so there's an innocence on Daniel's part. Hadn't done anything wrong. You see, when Jesus is speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, he's describing all these blessings bestowed upon people who are trying to live right. And he would say, blessed are ye. Blessed are ye. Then he gets down and he said, blessed are ye when you suffer for righteousness' sake. When you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, blessed are ye. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Guess who one of those prophets was? Daniel. What did he do? The right thing. Who did he give credit for this condition that his deliverance is in? He gives that credit to God. Then the king was exceeding glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found in him, because he believed in God. Now here's Daniel in the lion's den, and the angel had delivered him and shut the mouths of the lions. You remember when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was in the fire, the king Nebuchadnezzar saw somebody else in the fire. God didn't leave them. God was present with them. God delivered them. And now God sent an angel to stop the mouths of these lions. And then the king commanded that they bring those men who had accused Daniel and cast them into the lion's den, and their children and their wives, and the lions had mastery over them and break all their bones in pieces. And when they came to the bottom of the den. So it wasn't the fact that the lions weren't hungry. It wasn't the fact that the lions couldn't have devoured Daniel. It was a matter of that Daniel's God had delivered him. But these people who didn't believe in Daniel's God, who tried to persecute Daniel, learned something that you and I know. You look at passages like Hebrews chapter 10, and you get down to verse 30 and following, when it tells us to be respectful toward God and not to trodden underfoot the Son of Man, because if we do, we're reminded that God has said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. So this God who had put Darius on the throne and told the ones who would be on the throne, use those in power to bring vengeance upon those who accused Daniel. I learned some lessons about that, to stay focused on God. Allow God to handle those matters. It's a liberating thing for me not to say, how can I get even? How can I hurt them the way they hurt me so they won't hurt me anymore? I don't have to worry about that. The Bible is filled with examples of God taking care of that. Aren't you glad? You don't have to stay up at night saying, how can I do this? Well, it can consume you, can it? Everything you think about, say, okay, Yep, here's what I'm going to do. Now all of a sudden you become them. Daniel didn't participate in that. God took care of him. Guess who's going to take care of these accusers? The one who manipulated not only Daniel, but the king in signing this edict. Now they're thrown into the lion's den, and they are devoured. But not only them, but their families. Now we want to end where we started. And then King Darius wrote unto all the people. Notice that little focus was on them saying, how are we going to trap Daniel? It's going to have something to do with his God's commandments. And then the king looked at this and said, Daniel, the servant of the living God, your God's going to deliver you. He comes to the den and saying, Daniel, oh Daniel, was your God able to deliver you? And when Daniel's voice comes up, the burden is lifted off the king. He lifts Daniel up out of that, and now he's going to make a declaration so everybody's focus is upon the God of Daniel. And he wants all people, all nations, all languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree. I make a decree that every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. Wow, the focus on God. Here's this heathen king, because of Daniel keeping the focus on God in his own life, and he's consistent about it, and then God delivering him because the king knew the only one that could deliver Daniel would be his God. And now that that's happened, a declaration is made. Another decree is given, and the acknowledgement of God is pronounced to the whole nation. I think most of us sitting in this building tonight would think that would be really far-fetched, that we could live in such a way that the president of this nation would say, I want to make a decree, and you just insert your name, that the God of, and you put your name there, the living God of will be feared because he lives forever. His kingdom will stand forever. His people will be forever. We think, well, that's... But you see, it started way back when Daniel was a young man. He purposed in his heart. Never lost that purpose. Wasn't inconsistent. Didn't have on and off days. Didn't say, well, if this works out, then I'll serve God. He's going to serve God regardless. And it permeated that whole nation of people. What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. You rejoice and be exceeding glad. You're not surprised, are you? That he continues in that Sermon on the Mount, he said, you are the light of the world. You are cities set on a hill. What in the world is he saying? You have an opportunity to be a light to a dark world. You don't want to put that under a bushel. You don't beat your chest and say, look at me. You live in such a way that you are connected with your God. And when people see you, they are reminded of your God because your God does things like you're doing. But you let your light so shine that men may see your good works. And guess what they'll do? And glorify your Father who art in heaven. Where's our reward? Great is your reward in heaven. So if I live in such a way that I draw attention to my God and I'm consistent in my relationship with my God, why wouldn't that permeate my family, my spiritual family, my community, my professional relationship? if I'm consistent with it. And Daniel was consistent. The king said, whom ye continually serve. You're consistent in your relationship to God. And he said, and he delivered and rescued and worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, and hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel prospered. Not because he was trying to prosper, but because he did the right thing in the right way. Paul said to Timothy, and if you want to read the whole chapter, you'll see in 2 Timothy chapter 3, he talked about those who are persecuting Christians and those who are not abiding in truth. And then he said, all who will live righteously in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. But Paul asked the Roman Christians, what shall separate us from the love of God? And then he had this long list of things. And among those things, persecution? No, not going to separate us from the love of God. That's my goal, is to do more every single day so I can get closer to having that kind of life that would have that kind of influence and would cause everybody who knows me to know my God the way everybody in that kingdom knew the God of Daniel. I'm going to stand before that God one of these days, and I'm going to be judged about the things that I've done, whether they're good or whether they're evil. We serve a gracious, kind, benevolent, loving God that ought to motivate us to live that kind of life. And no matter the circumstances, likely none of us will be thrown into a lion's den. But sometimes life is just cruel, isn't it? Sometimes we might be lying in a hospital bed, suffering excruciating pain. That may be our lion. You see, none of those Hebrew youth knew whether they'd be delivered from those circumstances. But they were consistent in knowing those circumstances would not separate them from their God. Some of the greatest testimonies you and I can give about our relationship to God is how we handle those difficult circumstances. If we make up our mind ahead of time and not start trying to manipulate God and say, if you'll do this, I'll do that, just say, I am going to do what God told me to do. If we're consistent about that, those caregivers, when we're on that hospital bed, and they see us consistently praying to our God, trusting in our God, talking about our God, telling them about our God, they may come to know God. If that's when we abandon Him because we think He's abandoned us, then we forfeit our opportunity. We will be devoured by the lion because he will be successful in causing our minds to be diverted from our God, and therefore causing those around us never to see Him, never trust Him, never obey Him, never acknowledge Him. What about you tonight? Do you trust Him? If you do, then you'll believe in His Son. That's how He saved you. He loved you enough to give His Son. If you believe that Jesus is His Son, that'll motivate you to turn from your sins and repentance because He had to die for our sins. That'll motivate you with your own lips to say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That will motivate you to be obedient to Him in baptism. then when you arise, you will have put on Christ. Guess who you look like? Christ. Guess what you do? Christ-like things. So that people will say, they have been with Jesus. They live for Him, and they would die for Him. You can have that tonight. Those of us who've done that, sometimes, the fiery furnace gets hot, doesn't it? Sometimes the roar of the lions frighten us. But if our love for and our devotion and our commitment to God is the greatest thing in our life, we can live it with confidence. And God will use us in a powerful way. If we can help you do that, you let that be known while we stand, while we sing.